This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi Sai. So I want to speak a little bit about Kinnos. Kinnos is supposed to be a recitation of the tragedies that happened to Klal Yisrael, and the purpose of it is not limud Torah. The purpose of it is to evoke the emotion for the tzara that happened. But at the same time, because the Kinnos were written by great Talmidei Chachamim, many of the statements that they make, you could learn from there various halachas and shitos, what they hold about various inyanim. So even though on Tisha B'Av itself, we don't have shiurim on the halachas that we derive from the Kinnos and what the shita of the Baal HaMakoinen is, but nevertheless, it's still a chelik of Torah that we could learn a number of halachas. So the first thing we have to know is who wrote the Kinnos. So we have about 45 Kinnos that we say during the day. And the most well-known of all the Paitanim, the most well-known of all the authors of Kinnos was Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir, who is universally accepted as the father of the Kinnos. In fact, the Shiboile Haleked, which is quoted in the Magen Avraham and Siman Samaches, tells us that he heard from his father, who heard from his Rabbeim, that when Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir composed a piyut about the Malachi Mala, so a fire came down from Shemayim and encircled Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir. So, we're dealing with people of tremendous caliber. The Mari Hertz writes that when Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir wanted to compose one of the piyutim, so he would utter a shem, and he would go up to the Shemayim, and the Malach Michael would give him tips on how to praise Hashem. And one of the tips that the Malach Michael taught Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir was to compose based on the order of the Aleph Beis. But be it as it may, Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir was a great personality. There is a machlokes as to who exactly he was. So, it's a machlokes rishonim. The Tosfos in Chagiga on Daf Yud Gimel says that Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir was Rabbi Eliezer bar Reb Shimon, Rabbi Eliezer the son of Reb Shimon bar Yochai. The Rashba, in the Tshuvas HaRashba on Siman Tuf Samach Tes, he identifies Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir as Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. So you're dealing with a Tana over here. Either Rabbi Eliezer the son of Reb Shimon bar Yochai, or Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. So be it as it may, you're dealing with somebody, aside from being a great Makoinen, was a great Talmid Chacham as well. So what I want to focus on are a number of interesting halachos that you could derive from the Kinnos. So in Kinna Yud, very interesting statement in Kinna Yud. It's talking about the cessation of the Mishmaros, Kahuna. We know there are 24 Mishmaros of Kahuna that were Misakin. The Gemara in Taina says that it was Niskan by David and Shmuel. And there's a line here which is a very telling line. It says like this: V'damam roin mipi noisei ha'arain. V'damam roin mipi noisei ha'arain. And V'damam, it was silent. Roin, song. Mipi, from the mouths of Noisei Ha'arain, the bearers of the Arain. So what is this talking about? That because of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, the Kohanim who carried the Arain, their song was silenced. So let's see if we could find it. Right, so the question, right, it's the second line in Kinna Yud. So to pay attention for Tuesday morning. Eicha yashva chavatzal sasharoin v'damam roin mipi noisei ha'arain. The song ceased from those who carried the arain. So the question is, everybody knows the Kohanim did not carry the arain. Excuse me, the who sang in the Beis Hamikdash? The Leviim sang. Who carried the arain? That's the shaila. Who carried the arain in? Who carried the arain in the midbar? So the Rambam says in the Sefer HaMitzvos, in Mitzvah Lamed Daled, the Rambam says, "Mitzvah Lamed Daled, who shetzivanu sheyisu hakohanim ha'arain al kisveihem Kishinasratza losei sa'osei mimakim. Who amro yisala ki avodas hakodesh aleihem ba'kesav yisod. The shita of the Rambam is the kohanim carry the arayin. That's not what the Torah says. The Torah says ve'afa pishazeh hatzivoi ba l'leviyim be'esahi. The pasuk I'm quoting that the kohanim should carry the arayin was a pasuk said to Leviyim. Amnam hayazel lemiyot misvar hakohanim bizman hahu. That pasuk was saying was being mamayet the number of kohanim who lived then ki arayin hu arosh. Amnam ledoyrois chayavim b'mitzvazu hakohanim v'hemisuhu. Shitas Haramam is that in the midbar the Leviyim carry the arayin, and in Eretz Yisrael the kohanim carry the arayin. K'moshe esbar b'sefer Yoshua b'sefer Shmuel. If you look throughout Nevi'im, says the Rambam, the kohanim always carry the arayin. Uchshetziva David laseis ha'arayin b'pam hashenis. It says in Divrei Hayamim, vayisu b'nei haLeviyim es arayin alekim, kasher tziva Moshe b'dvar Hashem b'kesefam b'moites aleim. V'chein kishazachar b'divrei hayamim chalukas hakohanim le'esem ha'arba mishmaris v'yamar achar zeh ela p'kudasam la'avoidasam lavei le'veises yom mishpatim biyad arayin aviyim. Roimeis lios avodas hakohanim laseis ha'arayin ala kasef. The shita of the Rambam is that even though in the midbar the Leviyim carry the arayin, in Eretz Yisrael the kohanim carry the arayin. So the question is, what does the kinna mean? V'damam roin mi pinoisei arayin. The song was silence from the carriers of the arayin. The kohanim carry the arayin, and the kohanim were not the ones who sang. The kohanim never sang. So it's a stira. Must be, the Mefarshim say, the shita of the Ramban, was the Ramban argues on the Rambam. The Ramban in Shoresh Gimel of the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Ramban says no. The same way the Leviyim were mitzvah to carry the arayin in the midbar, they were also mitzvah to carry the arayin in Eretz Yisrael. So it comes out then that it would seem that Rav Lezer HaKalir holds like the Ramban and not like the Rambam, which is a little bit of a problem for the Rambam because Rav Lezer HaKalir was probably a Tana. So, the Rambam could argue on the Ramban, but l'chayr he can't argue on Reb Lezer ben Arach or Reb Lezer Reb Shimon. So that's a question. And if you look at most Kinnos, it says Reb Lezer HaKalir seems to be going like the Shita of the Ramban and not like the Rambam. So Reb Soloveitchik in his Kinnos, he feels no, it's more mistaber that the Baal HaKinna is going l'fi the Shita of the Rambam. Why? Because the whole Kinno Yud is talking about the cessation of the Mishmaris Kahuna. So if he's going like the Ramban, v'damam roin mi pinoisei arayin, it has absolutely nothing to do with that Kinna. We're not talking about what happened to Leviyim. I mean, we feel bad about what happened to Leviyim, but that's not what the Kinna is about. Kinna is about the cessation of the 24 Mishmaris Kahuna. So it's more mistaber that the Rav Lezer Kalir is going l'fi the Shita of the Rambam, that the kohanim carry the arayin. What does it mean, v'damam roin, that the song stopped, the kohanim didn't sing? So Rav Soloveitchik quotes a Yalkut Shimoni. The Yalkut Shimoni says that when Ezra came back to Yerushalayim, he looked for Leviyim, and he couldn't find any. There were no Leviyim. So we know that the Gemara tells us that he put a knas on the Leviyim, that you don't give Ma'aser Rishon to Leviyim, you give it to the kohanim. Fine, that I was aware of. But the Yalkut Shimoni takes it further, that he darshan the pasuk lo yia la kohanim haLeviyim kol shevet Levi chelek v'nachala. The pasuk says la kohanim haLeviyim. From there, Ezra derived that kohanim not only are kohanim, they also have the koach haLevi. Memela, since there were no Leviyim, he appointed the kohanim to sing shira. So that's more mistaber that what the Mekanya means is v'damam roin mipinoisei arayin, that the kohanim sai carried the arayin and they also sang shira. So an interesting perush in that line in Kinna Yud. Yeah. So no, the chiddush is that the kohen, you would think there's a koach hakohen, koach halevi. No, the kohen also has a koach halevi. Okay, there's another. Yeah. Why would they become Tamei Mace?
Because they're carrying the Aron.
Why do they become Tamei Mace by carrying the Aron? No, not the Aron of Yosef. The Aron of the Beis HaMikdash. Yeah. Okay, so there's another line here, which I don't think I would have made anything of. See if we can find it. Okay. Ched chata, they sinned. This is all in Kinnos Yud. Va'amran, they said le'elil to their idol. Ze'el, this is God. V'heliga, and they mocked. V'sita'a, and they made fun of b'choyze kel, the seers. They mocked the Nevi'im. So sounds good to me. So Rav Soloveitchik also brings that there's machlokes rishonim about this. What's the machlokes rishonim? The isser of not following the direction of the Navi. So the Rambam Shita is that it's a terrible thing to mock a Navi, but that's not the isser of the Torah. According to the Rambam in Hilchos Yesod HaTorah, Parak Tes Halacha Beis, Im kein lo menemer b'Torah Navi akim lahem mikar v'acheim kamoicha loy lasois dasu. In other words, Rambam wants to know, what's the mitzvah? The Torah says, I'm going to give you a Navi, and you have to listen to them. But we know they're not allowed to change the Torah, so why do you have to listen to them? Loy lasois dasu ba. He's not coming to change religion. Ela lotzavois al divrei haTorah. He's coming to encourage you to observe the Torah. Ulahazar ha'am shel yavroleh. The same way, who was the last Navi? Malachi. What were the last words of Malachi? Zichru Torahs Moshe. Well, what's the Chiddush? We already know we have to keep the Torah. The answer is that's the role of the Navi. The role of the Navi is to encourage you to keep the Torah. Or, see, if a Navi comes and says, don't wear tefillin, you don't listen. Actually, if he says it one time, if a Navi comes one time and says, don't wear tefillin, you do listen. As a Hirashah, he could tell you to be oiker in mitzvah saseh. If he tells you to eat chazer, even as a Hirashah, then you don't listen. But if let's say a Navi comes and says, what? The nafkamina is if he says sheva al tasa, then you listen. If he says kuma aseh, you don't. Okay. So, but let's say he tells you to do divrei rishus. He says this morning you can only eat whole wheat bagels. So you're mechuyev to listen. He's not telling you to violate the Torah, even though it's a Jewish thing to eat regular bay, but still, it's not a mamash halacha. He's not telling you mevatel Torah. Kugain l'chulamakam plani. Go here or don't go there. Make a war. Build a wall. Mitzvah l'shmayalai. V'ha'over al devarav chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. So the shita of the Rambam is that you have to listen to a Navi, and it has nothing to do with mocking the Navi. Rashi in Sanhedrin, that Peites, the way Rav Soloveitchik reads Rashi, which I'm not sure. Rashi divrei masav hamevater al divrei Navi hamafkiram sheloi chashash l'masha amar lei hanavi. So I would have read Rashi kipshutai. It means you don't listen to the Navi. I guess the fact that Rashi says the word hamafkiram, that you make the words of the Navi hefker, so if Soloveitchik understands that means that you mock the Navi. It's not enough just not to listen. No, I'm not going. You say, hey, what are you? You call him a name and then you don't listen. That's Rashi learns it's two things: mafkiram and loy shama aleim. Memela, when the Mekainen says that v'heliga v'sita'a, they mock the Navi, that seems to be going lefi shitas Rashi. According to the Rambam, that's not an ingredient of oiver divrei hanavi. Why is the Mekainen? We might have said, I don't know, he's being poetic. If it's written by a Rishon or earlier a Tana, then every word carries significance. He's writing that because his shita in Oiver al Divrei Hanavi is it's not enough not to listen. It's necessary also to mock. Okay, I'll tell you an interesting thing. In the Art Scroll Kinnos, they say that the first kinna that talks about a tragedy other than the Churban is Kinna Chavhei, which is a Kinna about the crusade. It's not correct. Rav Soloveitchik says it's Kinna Chav Beis. And if you read Kinna Chav Beis, it's clearly talking about the destruction of the Rishonim and the destruction of Europe during the times of the Crusades. But there's a line here, a very interesting line, but I'll start off with the following introduction. It's a funny thing. We know that Rashi wrote on Tanakh, except for Divrei Hayamim. Divrei Hayamim is not Rashi. Rashi wrote on Shas. He's on the inside part of the page. How do we know it doesn't say Rashi? It doesn't have to say Rashi. We know it's Rashi. There are a few exceptions where it does say Rashi, and then it's not Rashi. For example, Rashi on the Rif is not Rashi. Why? Because it says Rashi. It's false advertisement. It's like, there's always false. Or on the Ein Yaakov, it says Rashi, it's not Rashi. Rabbi Chazan was once giving Shiur, so he asked the steer between Rashi on the Rif and Rashi on the Masechta, and he said the answer is it's not a steer because Rashi on the Rif is not Rashi. The question is, Masechta Nedarim, we know for sure it's not Rashi. It says Rashi, it's not Rashi, it's somebody else. And that's why Masechta Nedarim is one of the hardest Masechtas. In the times of the Gaonim, they didn't learn Masechta Nedarim Be'iyun. They didn't have Rashi. Now we have the Ran supplants Rashi and Tosfos. Masechta Nazir is a very big mystery. Whether Masechta Nazir, the Shita of the Maritz Chios is it's not Rashi. However, the Stei Chemed says it is Rashi. So that's the one case where you have machlokes. Is it Rashi or is it not Rashi? It's very interesting. If you look in Kinnos Chav Beis, he's bemoaning the destruction of these communities. There's a line here, very interesting line. He says, let's see if we can find it. Oh, Mi yikatza b'gvais, who could cut through the heights? Umi yisates b'harim, who could chisel out the mountains? Umi yifarek havayos, who's going to answer our questions now? Meaning with the loss of the Talmid Chacham, who's going to answer our questions? Umi yitaret shvarim, who's going to far for all the broken pieces? Umi yafli nazirois, umi yaroich nedarim, who will be able to enunciate for us the halachos of naziros, and who will be able to set forth for us the laws of nedarim? So Bishlam, I understand, who's going to set forth for us the laws of Nadarim. Nadarim is halacha l'maisa, every day of the year. A person could get in trouble with Hilchos Nadarim. For example, if a person does a good thing 3 times, it's begeder a neder, and you have to continue unless you're mater neder. Or if a person does a mitzvah, if a person does a mitzvah and they don't say it's b'li neder, it could be a mitzvah, it could be a neder. So I remember one time I was saying a certain thing, and I don't want to say it anymore. Whatever, I wanted to learn. So I said, fine, it's better to learn. Yeah, very nice, but it's a neder. So I got 3 people together. I said I was doing a certain thing. I was saying a certain thing, and I did it because it was a good thing to do. But I didn't realize it would take away from something else. So I want to be and mutar, fine. But you have to do it. You have to know the halachas. So I understand with the loss of these Talmid Chachamim, who's going to set forth for us the laws of Nadarim. But what in the world does it mean? Who's going to teach us Hilchos Naziros? We don't need anyone to teach us Hilchos Naziros. Naziros is not Noigeya anymore. Even though Lamaisa, there was a Nazir. You ever hear, the Nazir in Eretz Yisrael? What? In Yerushalayim, right? Right? His name was, he was the father-in-law of Rav Goren, and the father of Rav Shari Yashav Cohen. Whatever. The Nazir. He was the editor of Rav Kook's Svarim. He was called the Nazir. Be it as it may, L'maisa l'halacha, he was the only Nazir that there was in the last couple hundred years. It was not Neged. There were no Nazirim in the times of the Crusades, in the times of the Rishonim. There were no Nazirim. So what does it mean? Mi yarech lanu, mi yafli Naziros. So Soloveitchik says, what do you think it means? It means Rashi never wrote a commentary on Masechta Nazir. Now, had there not been the Crusades, probably a great person would have arose and filled the shoes of Rashi and wrote a perush on Nazir so that Masechta Nazir would be understandable. But because of the destruction of these communities, miyafli Naziros, we're stuck with a Masechta that's very difficult to understand and decipher. That's the meaning of the words miyafli Naziros. So I just realized this morning, then it comes out that this is a raya to the Maritz Chios, that Rashi on Nazir is not Nazir. It's a kasha on the pretty strong kasha on the Stei Chemed. Who wrote Perek Chav Beis seems to be coinciding with supporting the shita of the Maritz Chios. Okay, one last thought, and we'll hold it. Let's see. This is Kinnos Lamed Vav. Kinnos Lamed Vav. This is a beautiful Kinnos. This is written by one of the great Paitanim, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the author of the Kuzari. This is Kinnos Tzion Haloy Sishali, right? Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was a great oihev of Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim. So he says a line over here, which is a little bit of a question, and that is, he says that in Eretz Yisrael, Sham Hashchina Shchena Lach. Then Eretz Yisrael, the Shechina is your neighbor. What does that mean in Eretz Yisrael, the Shechina is your neighbor? Presumably it means that God is close in Yerushalayim or in Eretz Yisrael. But here's the problem. The problem is the Shechina in Eretz Yisrael? After the Churban. Is the Shechina in Eretz Yisrael? Because we know the Shita of the Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, Perek Vav, Halacha Tes Vav. Lefikach, Makrivin HaKarbonis Kulan Afal Pi She'ein Sham Bayis Banoi. The Rambam Shita is you could bring Karbonis B'zman Hazeh. Why? Shekdusha Rishayna Kitsha L'Shaita V'Kitsha L'Asad Lavai. Because the Kedusha of the Mikdash and the Mizbeach was sanctified for that time and was sanctified forever. So why don't we? So that's the subject of a lot of discussion. Either we're tamei, or we don't know the exact location of the Mizbeach, but the missing factor is not that the Shechina is not there. The Shechina is there, according to the Rambam. Says the Rambam, so v'lama ani omer b'mikdash v'yishalayim shekdusha rishana kedusha l'asad lavai ukedusha shar Eretz Yisrael le'inyan shviyas u'maisvas v'yotz ben loy kitcha l'asad lavai. The shita of the Rambam is that the kedusha of Yerushalayim is eternal, and the kedusha of the rest of Eretz Yisrael is batal. Why? So the Rambam says the reason is l'fisha kedushas hamikdash is because of the shechina. Ushchina ina betela. Shenemar v'hashimoy says mikdashechem. V'amru chachamim afal pi sheshayim b'kedusha neinamim. Aval chiyuv haaretz einoi elam ibnei shu kivush rabim. The reason why Eretz Yisrael has kedusha is because we conquered it. V'kivan shenilkacha haaretz mideyim, but once it was taken away, batal hakivush v'niftera min hatar min ha'maisrais. The kivan sha'ala Ezra, the kitcha, loy kitcha bekivush ela b'chazaka. Therefore, whatever he was machzik has kedusha, and whatever he was not machzik does not have kedusha. Lamaisa, what do we see from here? That the Shechina is only in the Makam HaMikdash and Yerushalayim, but the Shechina is not in the rest of Eretz Yisrael. So there's a question: what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi means that in Eretz Yisrael the Shechina is your neighbor? Well, how's the Shechina your neighbor? If you live in Tzfas, he's not your neighbor. He's not there. So he's your neighbor because Yerushalayim is neighboring by. So the Shaila, is it because Rabbi Yehuda Halevi argues on the Rambam and he says the Shechina is in all of Eretz Yisrael? Or is he only talking about Yerushalayim when he says the Shechina is your neighbor? Okay, so Rabbi said just give you a little taste and flavor to the fact that besides the inyan that the main inyan of Kinnos is certainly to evoke the emotion for the tsar, but really every line is contains tremendous halachos and yisodos in Torah, and is a chelak of Torah also. So we should talk about Zoicha that I believe Reb Chaim Kanievsky says that even when Mashiach comes, we'll still learn Kinnos as part of Torah. It's not going to be something to mourn, but it's still a chelak of Torah. And v'lo moed anu tzarach. Okay, shkayach. All right.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.